Hi, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's online event program. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the director of the bookstore's events. And I'm so pleased today to have Donald Nicholson-Smith here to discuss the new translation of Serge Pey's Treasure of the Spanish Civil War in conversation with novelist Caleb Crain. We're especially happy to be able to partner on this program with our friends at Archipelago Books, and that we're able to reach so many of you in the comforts of your homes. And though, normally I would love to offer everyone some event wine, tonight is strictly BYOB. So while I'm talking, run over and get a drink. I'm the least important part of this program. So to the housekeeping for tonight, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button that's just here at the bottom of your screen and where you can submit a question. We'll try to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the event. There's also going to be a chat button down here where I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, as well as a link to donate to organizations fighting racism and police brutality if that is within your means. A caveat for tonight's event and for all virtual programs, we're at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise during the program. We'll try to solve those very quickly. And finally, we're adding more virtual programming through the summer and into the fall, so please do check in on our event listings or sign up for our newsletter to find out more. This Thursday, we're hosting Ottessa Moshfegh for the release of her new novel, Death in Her Hands, with Ariel Levy. And next Thursday, our NYRB Classics series welcomes the inimitable Diane Johnson live from Paris to discuss her biography, The True History of the First Mrs. Meredith, with Classics editor Edwin Frank. You can register for all of these and more on our website. So now a little about tonight's presenters, and we'll get started. Donald Nicholson-Smith was born in Manchester, England, and is a longtime resident of New York City. His translations, ranging from psychoanalysis and social criticism to crime fiction, include works by Guy Debord, Antonin Artaud, and J.B. Pontelly, including many others. His translation of Apollinaire's Letters to Madeleine was shortlisted for the 2012 French-American Foundation Prize for Nonfiction, and in 2014, he won the Foundation's Fiction Prize for his translation of Jean-Patrick Manchet's The Mad and the Bad. His translation of In Praise of Defeat by Abdelatif Labi was shortlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize in 2017. And Caleb Crain has written for The New Yorker, Harper's, The Paris Review, The Atlantic, The New York Review of Books, N+1, and The New York Times Book Review. He is the author of the novels Overthrow and Necessary Errors, and the critical work American Sympathy. He was born in Texas, raised in Massachusetts, and lives in Brooklyn. So Caleb and Donald, the stage is yours.
Thank you, thank you. Welcome, good to see you, Donald.
Hi there.
Oh, hi. Yeah, so thanks to all of you virtual people for coming. I know Donald wants to start by reading a story, but before we did that, I thought we should just sort of say a little bit about the book. This is what it looks like. And it's called The Treasure of the Spanish Civil War, but Donald and I were talking earlier about how that's actually a little, maybe not misleading, but a little confusing, because it's not just about the Spanish Civil War. How would you characterize the book, Donald?
Well, I mean, that people have problems characterizing the book. The French, for some reason, the publishers decided it was a novel. Well, I'm sure you know, being who you are, that it's not a novel, whatever else it is. It's a set of somewhat related short stories, and it belongs to the experience of one man, the author, and his parents and his antecedents, because basically he's using the voice of his family to write these stories. He was not born during the Spanish Civil War. His parents were anarchists and communists, his grandparents even, in Spain. And when the Spanish Civil War ended, they ended up in France in concentration camps put together by the French. That is the sort of context of these stories, which are fiction, but they're very much involved with his memories and the memories that and the recollections of his family, his parents. He put them back together, in some cases to evoke a period where he was not there, partly in Spain. partly in France, and partly even later on, maybe up until the early 1950s. But the stories don't have, they're not strictly anchored in
Yeah.
time and place. I mean, place, yes, but time and actual location, not so much.
Yeah, there's no naming of towns, really.
No naming of many things that could have been named.
But occasionally there are moments where he sort of says, like, these people were killed between 1945 and 1960, or
Yeah,
this
but
happened.
barely.
Yeah, very
We can
rarely.
interpret that, we can figure that out, yes, but
Yeah,
it hardly
yeah.
says it.
The other thing that
Hardly
might spring,
says it.
that people might be confused about, they might think that because it's about the Spanish Civil War that you translated it from Spanish, but that's not the case, right?
Not in the slightest, and he wrote it in French himself. He's, in fact, a French citizen, but he's the child of Spanish emigres who came after the defeat of the Republic. They tramped across the Pyrenees, and they were interned in France when they arrived in France, in the south of France, on the Mediterranean, in what are now really well-known holiday resorts, beach towns, specifically, and we can be specific because we know where his people were. They were in a town called Argelès-sur-Mer, which is now a very fashionable beach.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, it was a concentration camp. And there were many other concentration camps put together by the French, not just for the Spanish emigres, but for many other people as well, that they needed to lock up undesirable foreign workers, basically. That's the
Yeah.
context.
Yeah, yeah. I think you can feel that in the stories that they're maybe not his personal. They don't seem to be his personal stories, but they seem to be stories that he has a very personal connection to. That I feel like as I was reading them, I felt like, oh, this feels like a story about his father or his mother or an aunt or an uncle that he didn't experience directly, but that he had some kind of access to the interiority of through his family, maybe. That was.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a work of memory. It's a work of remembering and memorializing the experiences that he feels his inheritance.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
he is a child. Often the publisher says, the French publisher, for example, or his bio says he's a child of the Spanish Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
He's really a child of the children of the Spanish Civil War, more accurately.
Right.
But
Which is
that's
maybe
his war. That's his war.
Yeah.
And he lives in it, and he lives in what followed in terms of the internment of all these Republicans who were greeted in France by simply being thrown into internment camps.
Yeah.
Very badly treated.
I mean, I think we all know that the Spanish Civil War was ethically messy from having read Orwell, but it turns out that this aftermath of the Spanish Civil War was, if anything, more messy. This refugee, and his story is definitely.
It was messy in its own way, and it was also, of course, a prelude to the Second World War.
Right.
Because everything is ultimately defined by the fact that nobody, the French and the Brits, never intervened in Spain to fight fascism, and then
Right.
they had to fight fascism big time. Had
Right.
they intervened in Spain, things might have been a little bit different. So that's the tragic historical background, that mid 20th century moment when the Western powers failed to combat fascism and were soft on it, in fact.
Yeah.
When they should have been just the opposite.
Right. No, it was a big disappointment to the Republicans in Spain that the French government decided to be.
It was more than disappointment. They were defeated on account of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Only the Germans intervened in Spain. The only people, and they intervened on Franco's side, of course.
Right, right. So I know you wanted to start by reading a selection. Do you want to say something about the selection that you're going to start with?
Well, yes, it's a little difficult to choose, but I just decided to read from the first story in the book, which is called An Execution.
Okay.
And to be very brief, I mean, it's an imagined story about a boy and his father who are working, they're in the fields, which they own, and they're basically just, well, they're basically just hanging out there, maybe doing a little work. But there's suddenly soldiers appear. Actually, they're not soldiers. They're more Guardia Civil. In other words, they're sort of paramilitaries that are looking to appropriate their farm. And one imagines that this is supposed to be happening in Spain, you know, prior or during the Spanish Civil War. The father is shot by the Guardia Civil, the soldiers, and the boy is left there trying to figure out what's happening. So we'll just start in the middle of the story, I'm afraid, but we don't have time to read the whole thing. I'll just start here, and I just have to get a bit more light on the subject.
Okay.
That doesn't affect the picture. I'm not in the middle of the picture. I'm just in the corner of my screen. I don't know if I should do something about it. Maybe I should. No, there I am. Yeah.
There you go.
I'm controlling everything now.
Okay.
Here's where I start. And this is there was a word here that you liked in a communication with me.
I had to look it up, but yes, I really liked it.
Yes, you had to look it up, and so we have to explain what it is. But anyway,
Okay.
the first sentence is the boy watched an eagle wheeling in the sky as though harnessed to an invisible noria. The majestic bird drew all the sunshine towards the two of them where they stood amidst the shadows. The boy would remember this. A noria is, the analogy is a water wheel, which collects water. It's an ancient machine for gathering water in little cups, and so it's very much like a water wheel that we know from an ordinary water mill, but it's actually not quite the same because it's just collecting water and putting it into a sort of tiny aqueduct, which then, you know, draws the water away to wherever it's needed. So it's just a system of collecting water, and it's that's the analogy. The majestic bird drew all the sunshine towards the two of them where they stood amidst shadows. The boy would remember this. The man kept silent for a long while, observing the eagle as it turned towards the mountain, perhaps to check its work and draw the sun to another valley. At last the man turned and spoke to the boy. "Give me your knife." The man took the piglet which had been killed by the soldiers and wrapped it in leaves, then dug a hole and lit a fire in it with dry wood. When he had glowing embers, he placed the animal's spread eagle's carcass on them and covered it with soil. The boy and the man had been collecting stones all morning without exchanging a single word when the boy suddenly came upon a snail's glistening shell under an old tree stump. It was glossy and yellow. A bluish spiral wound up around it to the gaping hole that once contained and protected the creature's body. The boy picked up the shell and showed it to the man. "I found a shell." "Keep it, kid," the man replied. "They say that shells bring good luck because they hold the voices of the departed." The boy thought to himself that it would soon be midday. And indeed, the man pointed out the shortening shadows as they climbed the mountainside and shrank little by little. By the time the pig was ready, the sun was casting no shadows. There's a little bit of an interval there. The boy was crouched by the spring, filling their canteen, when he saw a flock of birds rise suddenly from a bush. Further off, the noise of a waterfall had abruptly become the only sound. Then he sensed them up above with their horses. He heard a man's voice yelling words he did not understand. 3 shots rang out, followed by a 4th. For a brief moment, the silence in the boy's chest was broken, and the roar of the waterfall was deafening. A horseman had asked, "Where's the kid?" A rasping voice answered, "Go and see and take care of him. He must be by the stream. You set fire to the hut and the chicken coop." The boy dragged himself in among an old oak tree's roots, which, as they wound between rocks, had created a niche. he had discovered earlier while trailing a fox. This hideaway was exactly the right size for him. He crawled backwards into the burrow and pulled a branch across the entrance to conceal it. Then he let himself slip down to the point where the narrow passageway made a right-angle turn and continued underneath a boulder. Sweat trickled into the boy's eyes, and for a moment he stopped breathing. The sound of his heart filled the whole den. He felt as though he no longer had any heart, and that the whole universe was a vast throbbing. The guard came down to the spring. The boy knew that he was inspecting the canteen that he had left behind, and the wine bottle tinkling like a bell under the stream of water. The horse came close, passed above the rocks, then returned and halted by the branches that concealed his hiding place. The guard knew the boy was in there. He sensed the boy's presence. He was a hunter, honed like a knife, well used to tracking every kind of game, man or beast. The boy pictured him flaring his nostrils and deeply inhaling the scent of the forest as he scanned the trees without turning his head. "What are you doing?" came the far-off voice of the corporal. "Did you find him?" The guard guided his horse around the rocks. The boy heard him dismount. The sound of his boots came nearer. Then he was pulling aside a few branches above the hidey hole. The guard knew that the boy was not far away. Suddenly his voice came, distant. "I know you're there. You can come out. I won't kill you." The boy knew that the guard had not seen him because he was speaking from the other side of the rocks. The guard was lying to gain his trust and then shoot him. The boy was behind the guard and very careful not to make the slightest movement for fear of causing stones to topple. "Come out of your hole. You can't stay in there all day." From the silence that followed, the boy realized that the guard had spotted the hole. The guard knew that the boy was down inside, crouched underground, but he could not enter the boy's hiding place because the passage was too narrow, so all he could do was fire blindly down the hole in hopes of hitting him. The boy told himself that he had a chance of surviving, for he was at the elbow bend in the burrow behind another rock. The boy sensed that the guard now had his rifle pointing at the entrance and was about to fire. "Come on, I'm not going to hurt you." A stone tumbled by the boy's shoulder. It was at that moment that the guard fired wildly into the den. The bullets passed close to the boy without hitting him and grazed the rock against which he was leaning. He remained motionless, burying his face in the earth. Then the voice of the corporal resounded again. "Come on back. Forget it. You got him. It's late already." The guard waited for a moment. The boy heard him reload his gun and then depart on foot, leading his horse. The boy did not budge. We'll leave them there.
Okay, we'll leave them there. Thank you. That was lovely. I really love that image of the Noria, which is the water wheel, and it's just such a lovely metaphor, almost visual metaphor, that the eagle circling in the sky, repeating the motion of the Noria. Just as a translator, how did you handle the challenge of having that very culturally specific image?
Well, I think this particular one was, I was lucky because it was somewhat isolated, so I just left the word as it was.
Okay.
I mean, anybody who doesn't know, like you or me, what it is, they can look it up, because that is the proper name for it.
Yeah.
And once you find out what it is, I mean, the image works.
Yeah.
But actually, I wasn't so lucky in many other parts of this book, because his style does periodically become very poetic.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us to the question of his style, which is, I think most accurately described as at once realistic and magical. But it's not magical realism in the sense of the cliche that we have.
Yeah, I wanted to
magical
ask about
realism.
that categorization. Yeah,
Not
how?
really magical
Uh-huh.
realism. And in any case, magical realism has become such a sort of kind of cliche. In fact, it means almost nothing now,
Hmm.
really,
Hmm.
except somewhat poetical and imaginary writing.
Yeah,
I don't think it has a lot of force anymore. It had a lot of force when it first came
yeah.
into
And
being, concerning certain styles of South American writers.
mhm.
But I don't think that it's a very useful name anymore.
With there's something almost Hemingway-esque about that first story. I mean, it's very like very
Yes,
honed, pruned language, very plain, very simple. But
yes,
the imagery is so beautiful that as you were reading it, I realized I hadn't noticed that when the boy picks up the snail shell, that there's an echo there with him hiding in the hole under
yes,
the oak
yes,
tree.
yes, yes.
Yeah,
Later in the story, he's been hiding in for many hours after the soldiers leave, and he comes out and described more or less phenomenologically from his own point of view. He gets very mixed up. He finds his father's, if it is his father, but we have to, I assume it's his father, but he's
mhm.
always called the man. He's only referred to as the man and the boy. And the man is dead, he's been shot. And he confuses his body with the snail's body. And he gets very mixed up, and there's a whole sequence which is quite hard to handle because it's he's delirious
Yeah,
basically, but it's told the delirium is described from within in a completely, you might say, deadpan manner. I mean, there's no
mhm.
sign that is delirium. It's just presented in the same tone of voice as the more realistic description of earlier on, which is very effective actually. But that's how this man writes very often.
Yeah,
Things suddenly sort of dissolve into a kind of into an imaginary space, very literary kind of device, I have to say, but I think he's very good at it.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not easy for the translator, though. I mean, and I'm
Uh-huh.
not whining about it, but I mean, it is something you have to
What are the
try to
challenges
handle
that
because there's a
is
change
it
of register, but not
okay?
seemingly a change of register.
So it's a matter of tone?
That in some way, then the tone remains the same, but what is being described becomes um, I can't, the word poetic doesn't do it, but
Hmm.
I don't know what to call it. What
Yeah.
people love to call it is surreal. And that's another word which I feel is now totally worn out to the
Uh-huh.
point of having no significance whatsoever. Anything is surreal if it's a little bit offbeat. That's all you have to,
Yeah, right.
we'll
Well,
use it all the time.
the
Yeah,
news is surreal. So yeah,
yeah,
reality is surreal. So
yes,
we
right,
we've
right.
lost that
Yeah,
distinction maybe.
right,
Um,
right. So
yeah,
that's it. And that's what he does very often in this book. The stories are very varied and in terms of content, very different. They're somehow interconnected, but basically he's ringing tunes or bells. They're all about his memories and those memories that he's sort of collected of his
yeah,
family.
yeah,
So and the imagination is often given full rein, but there's the real history which is there, and it's very much that's very much the case that the object is to, as I said before, to memorialize, to
yeah,
to bring back to memory things which have been probably deliberately forgotten. I mean, just to get back to the political for a moment, we
hmm.
all know how much the French wanted to forget all their sins leading up
Yes,
to and including the occupation, so-called, the Vichy government, and everything that went with that. It took them decades to actually admit to what had really happened. So I
yeah,
mean, this is another case that chain of concentration camps that they'd set up in southern France, way before the arrival of the Germans or anything, is very rarely spoken about. There are a couple of books on it. There's even a good book about these about this. Basically 500,000 Spaniards who came, some of them disarmed soldiers who were disarmed by the
yeah,
French, many of them children, women, refugees. It's reckoned to be about 500,000 altogether. There weren't 500,000 in this camp that we were
uh-huh.
talking, But there were a good many. There were many thousands in there on that beach.
Yeah.
And there were and they had to keep opening new camps to kind of accommodate the influx of refugees. This all reminds you of what's been going on in Europe in very recent times, right?
Yes, definitely.
The EU has been totally incapable of dealing with
Yeah.
in a unified way, or in fact in any way, properly speaking at all. I mean, it's very similar. Obviously, this was within what is now the EU, but it was the border between France and Spain. But
Yes.
now the border is between the EU and whatever's outside the EU. But I mean, the situation of this influx of impoverished, defeated, ill women, children, everybody, half of them dying on the way, it's just the same.
And they were communists and anarchists too.
We haven't got out of the 20th century.
Yeah.
You know, the EU was supposed to get us out of the. It was supposed to be something which would prevent the Second World War from ever being repeated. Well, we knew as soon as Yugoslavia happened that it had failed in this endeavor, because the war in Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia, had many features of a Second World War type.
Yeah, the Whig theory of history has been in trouble lately.
Well, lately, I mean, it never stopped being in trouble, I think.
So you were saying that there were other moments in translating these stories where it was a challenge to represent the cultural specifics. Can you think of anything like that?
No, not the cultural specifics. That's not a problem.
Okay.
What was hard to represent was the when it becomes dreamlike and
Oh, okay.
Poetic,
Okay.
in a brief
Right.
form. That's when it's difficult, because sometimes you don't know what the hell he's talking about, to put it
right. And you weren't in touch with him. You weren't able to sort of ask
him. I never had any
him.
communication with him whatsoever, not for any particular reason, but I didn't feel I had the need to.
Okay.
And he has a very busy life. He lives in Toulouse. He teaches poetry, and he travels the world with a kind of performance poetics, or whatever you want to call it. He calls it, I think he calls it a sort of action poetry.
Okay.
He goes around with a partner, and they do various sort of semi-theatrical street theater, but reading lots of poetry. And he's obviously very far left, this guy, and he's preaching in a way a very far left doctrine of peace, and he's an anarchist.
Yeah. Oh, is he an anarchist? Explicitly an anarchist?
Well, he never uses the word, but it's obvious to me that he's an anarchist. It's also always from the book that the people that he's writing about, or imagining, or combination, are anarchists as opposed to communists. Although in those camps there were many communists, there were many Trotskyists, there were many Stalinists. They were all there. They were all mixed up, of course, naturally. All the different kinds of Republicans were there. In fact, they had a lot of set twos amongst themselves, which had already been going on in Barcelona. Obviously, as everybody knows, in the famous May Days in Barcelona and everything else. So, so those conflicts persisted.
Yeah.
But it's fairly clear that he well, just from his present day activities, he's you can only describe his activity as an anarchist type poetry, but he's a pacifist kind of anarchist, who just preaches, peace and everything like that. I mean, he's not a bomb thrower, he's not an anarchist in that sense.
Yeah, I feel like I sensed reading the stories, I felt like they were somewhere between the oral and the written. That makes sense that he's
a poet, and his poetry is spoken. He goes around talking poetry. He doesn't, of course it's all printed. He's written umpteen books of poetry, but yes, it is all very oral. You're absolutely right.
And then maybe that has something to do with the memory too, and also being a memory of a history that hadn't properly been written when he was growing up.
Yes.
That was being transmitted to him.
I think that's accurate. Yes, I think that's accurate. Yeah. Yes.
So it's now about 30 minutes in. Did you want to read another passage, or?
I could. Yes, I had another one in mind.
Okay.
And I'll do it.
And we've already got some good questions here too. So if you want to do some questions.
Well, I mean, I'll do what. Let me put you in charge. You decide. I'll try. I would kind of like to read a bit more.
Yeah. Why don't you read another passage?
Yes, I will. Well, okay. The second one that I had in mind is from a long story called longer. None of the stories are very long, but some of them are longish. And there's one called The Piece of Wood, which is incredibly brutal, which describes the ways in which the capos and the director of a prison camp, who had to deal with an influx of young boys, just children, and wanted to train them up as capos. He wanted to make them hardened in a way and capable of torturing the other people in the camp so that he could get information out of them. So it's very much a sort of I don't know if we use this word really, but it's a story of a carceral reality, right?
A casserole? Carceral.
Meaning,
Okay.
inside a prison or a prison
Right.
camp. I don't think, does that word exist, carceral? I don't know.
I think so, yes. I think so,
Okay.
yes.
I mean, I have problems sometimes because it exists in French. It's almost a not common, but it's an ordinary word in French. But I don't think it's that ordinary in English. These are translators' problems,
Yes.
really. Let me just make sure I can find this place where I was going to go. Page 56, okay. All right, so this boy is coming to this very horrible camp, and one of the ways in which he's the director of the camp, who is a real monster, he gets these young boys and gives them a puppy. Everyone gets a puppy, which they're encouraged to make friends with and to love effectively. But then he makes them hurt the dog or even kill the dog in order to save the life of one of their best friends. This is really a very nasty kind of trick that he had in order to try and make them do his bidding and become capos in effect, right? So that was the story, but that's the background. But the part that I'm going to read is just about when the kid decides to escape. The other thing you should know is that this one of the things they did in this, if they had something they didn't like, they would put them in oil drums that were suspended from trees and leave them there basically to starve to death. There were big oil drums, they were hung from trees, and they would just put their victims inside and pretend they would feed them for a few days, but basically many of them just died. So, but the kid manages to hide inside one of these oil drums along with the dead body of another boy. So that's what you have to know. And he escapes. It was at first light that the grown-ups would get rid of the corpses by throwing them in the river. But you had a chance to escape by hiding in one of the oil drums. After the evening soup, I gathered leaves and slipped them under my blanket and placed stones on top to anchor things down and prevent the wind from revealing that I was gone. My head I replaced with the body of my dead dog. I had called him Dog because in that place nobody had a name. I spread my scarf over Dog as though I were burying my own face. I felt that from now on the face I wore would be his. I kissed him and whistled gently into his ear as if I was calling him to come with me. Goodbye, dead doggy, I said. Goodbye, dead doggy. Groping my way along the walls and scuttling from one hut to the next, I taught myself to see with dog's eyes because I thought I was dead too. I was Dog's walking tomb, and I knew that on the other side of the world, he was guarding the part of me that had died with him and would be waiting for me one day. I melted into the shadows until I reached the monstrous line of trees, swaying slowly like pendulums. I circled the dangling oil drums marked with a white cross, which was the grown-ups' way of indicating the ones containing dead bodies. Then, after lifting a lid, I slid into one of them alongside someone from section 3 of the camp. His forehead was pressed against the metal side of the container as if he were asleep, but it was only his hands, clasped in a desperate prayer, that really gave the impression that he was alive. I stayed next to him for several hours without looking at him. I fell asleep against his back. When I woke, I thought it was Dog, who had suddenly grown bigger since he had died and come back to me. But it was only the body of a dead boy that I was hugging. The morning breeze had got up and the trees were creaking in the woods as their branches twisted this way and that. Gradually, Rain set up a relentless and regular tattoo on the oil drum. Its beat split my head in two. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. It was the grown-ups come for the drums. I lifted the body of my dead companion and slid underneath him to avoid discovery. The grown-ups began to swear. Today there are a bunch of fucking rats in these barrels. With this rain, we better make sure the truck doesn't get stuck in the mud. I knew they called us rats when we were dead. I felt the grown-ups picking up my drum, placing it upright on the bed of their truck. I was afraid the lid might come off, but a grown-up punched it firmly shut. During the short journey to the river, my companion's body moved and I wrapped my arms tightly around his belly. I was afraid that if ever his corpse slipped out of the drum, they would spot me at the bottom. The river's going to burst its banks if this shit doesn't let up, said one of the grown-ups who had stayed in the back to keep the drums upright. The truck pulled up. I knew from the sound of the rapids that we had come to the end of the road. We were about to be tossed from the truck into the water. A perfect rat's funeral. That night, there were 3 oil drums. Mine was the last. The water flooded in straight away through the breathing holes, and the drum rolled over. I had to use the boy's body for support as I popped the lid open. All of a sudden, I was free of him and starting to swim for the far bank with the help of the current.
Yes,
I could stop there.
Okay, yes, it's that story I think stuck in my mind as the most brutal of the stories.
Well, it is the worst one because of this
Yeah.
cruel practice that the man has of torturing, teaching the kids to torture by torturing them with making them fond of a dog.
Yeah,
It's
I think
very, very nasty.
as a dog owner, I had the most trouble with it.
Yes.
But as you sort of gave away, the boy does manage to escape, and that raises another question that I had. Was in a number of these stories, the camp or the prison seems incredibly brutal, and yet there's an escape. And I found myself wondering, is that magic or is that realism? Like, are we to understand that as a symbol of the escape, or were people actually able to escape? Or I don't know, or maybe it has to do with orality and sort of if you're hearing a tale being told aloud, you have to believe that the teller escaped. Otherwise, how can he tell you this story?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, but I think that it has a broader meaning. I think it's quite simply, really, that hope springs eternal in the human breast, and it also springs eternal in the hope of radical revolutionaries, even when they've lost, and I mean to say, obviously the Spanish Civil War was lost.
Yeah.
But in order to continue to have a radical critique of the society in which you find yourself and to continue to fight, to be a militant or to be an activist of any kind, you have to have hope. And therefore, these stories, I think the fact that escape figures in some of these stories just represents the fact that hope endures, in the consciousness of people who consider themselves and their family to have been lifelong fighters for the revolution.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, the alternative would be to say you'd abandoned any hope of radical social change. Let's put it that way.
Okay. So there's
I
a
think
political.
that's what it means.
Yeah, there's a political and philosophical.
Semi-conscious. I mean, it's not really in a kind of, it's not in a preachy way that he says this, but I think that's.
No, I think, yeah. As a reader, I experienced it almost with relief in this story.
Yes.
This story is so brutal. I was so happy and relieved that the boy escapes. But there's other stories that are in a prison that seems to be in Franco's Spain, and I was like, did anyone really get out of those prisons in Franco's Spain?
Well, yes, some of them did, and actually, it's interesting that many of well, not many.
Yeah, maybe not many. Yeah.
But in the years after, even after World War II, many of these people who he grew up with, or imagined that he grew up with, I don't really know. We would really have to have him here and ask him,
Right.
because I would have lots of questions for Serge Pey in terms of, to sort out the real from the wished for, or the imagined, or the reconstructed in an imaginary way.
Right.
But nevertheless, I'm quite sure that, and in fact, it's patent from one of the stories, that many of the people who figure in this book were actually working. They had gone back to Franco Spain to fight underground, and they were resistance fighters under the Franco regime. And they did release people from prison. They managed in some cases. So the Spanish Civil War didn't finish completely in 1939.
Yeah.
The opposition fought on, obviously unsuccessfly, but nevertheless there was resistance.
Yeah.
Also, the other thing is worth mentioning: a lot of these Spaniards, of course, became résistants in the French underground as well, fought alongside the French. Many of them, sadly, after that, were taken by the Nazis and sent to death camps in Germany. So they had many of them had, they got caught many times and killed eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is awfully hard to contemplate. It's just another aspect of that period of time when deaths were so many.
Yeah.
And the ones that ended up with many others went to Mexico, went to Dominican Republic. When I said 500,000 Spaniards escaped from Spain after the end of the war, they didn't all stay in France. Many
I see. Some of them were transiting
more than
through.
anybody else, but
Yeah.
in the end they went elsewhere. The Americans refused most of them. The Americans didn't want anything to do with them. They were commies, basically. I mean, it weren't anything that you wanted to have as an immigrant. And so that's a whole nother story, right? You should ask. Mr. Trump doesn't know anything about it, but he repeats history, doesn't he?
He's the latest chapter.
Not even knowing about history, he repeats.
Yeah. So there's some questions here from the audience. Let me go ahead and see if I can do this right. If you have questions, by the way, the Q&A button is the place to do it. So here's one for you, Donald. What is your process of historical research like when you prepare for a translation? Do you immerse yourself in the cultural work of the period or histories?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
I mean, the second part of my answer would be, well, I knew quite a bit of it anyway.
Okay.
But, the answer is no. I don't spend my time doing historical research. Well, I mean, it depends on what we're talking about. In the case of this particular book, no, I didn't need to make a lot of historical research. I did. I mean, to come here tonight and talk to you, I looked over a few notes that I had somewhere. But I mean, basically, no. The answer is no.
Okay. And you've translated a number of, I think we heard you translated Apollinaire's letters and
yes, I did.
And a number of so you're familiar with the French tradition anyway that he's writing in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I don't know quite how to answer it. I mean, every project is different.
Yeah.
I mean, some things you do have to do some research, of course.
There was, there's the story about the title story about the treasure of the Spanish Civil War. I went back and I was like, what did happen to Spain's gold during the Spanish Civil War? And then I'd forgotten, but there was this whole drama.
Well, there are lots of myths about about
exactly.
The gold. And this particular story is fanciful because they don't find the gold. They go digging for it on the beach and they dig a lot of holes and they don't find it. And the story is these anarchists, and they really are anarchists. He never uses the word. Had buried the gold somewhere, and they'd put a man in charge, and he had sworn a number of comrades to secrecy. And they had agreed that after 10 years had elapsed without anybody mentioning this treasure, they would go and dig it up. So 10 years later, or whatever number of years it was later, everybody gets a letter saying, well, the day has come, comrades, we have to go and dig it up. So they all set off to the beach and start digging holes, trying to find it. Now the gold in question, and there were many stories of gold, that had
Right.
been somehow belonged to one. I mean, my interpretation of this particular story, and you'd have to ask Serge Pey for confirmation, but I believe the gold that has become a legend, and that he, weaves this story around. That gold, I think, was gold that was stolen from the Communist Party by the anarchists and hidden. That's what I think is the basic subtext.
Because
It
the
isn't
famous
written in the story, but that's I think what it is.
Because the famous story is that the Soviets were willing to sell armaments to the Republicans,
Yes.
but they insisted that Spain, the Republican government, was the proper real government of Spain, that they literally transfer the gold ingots from Madrid to Moscow.
Yes.
And then the Russians, once they did that, the Russians took charge of all the accounting.
Yes.
And
That's true. The Russians, the Stalinists, absolutely, that's what happened. Yes, I mean, obviously that's exactly what happened. It's well known. So whether all that gold got all the way to Moscow, we don't know.
Right, and there was a lot of
it was the Communist Party that was doing the delivery. For the Republican government. So where they put it, and if some of it was stolen by the anarchists en route, it was perfectly possible. I mean, it doesn't necessarily be historically true, but it's a likely story. Let's put it that way.
Right, and you can see how it would give rise to lots of.
That's how I read it anyway.
Lots of myths.
But the beauty of the story is they don't find it.
Yeah.
And the guy who is their sort of leader, in fact, they call el comandante, and commandante. That's the only thing I think he's called. He obviously he's obsessed with finding it. He doesn't find it, but at the very end of the story, he says something which is rather. It's not just so much anarchist. I think it's a bit more Taoist. He says, the real treasure is the holes that we dug in the beach. And that was the treasure. And the holes are there. So we got the treasure. Something like that. And he says, I wrote this down. He says, the holes left in the beach at Argelès were the real treasures, but not everyone knew what he meant. Before that, he said, or after that, I don't know. He said, "You don't go where the road may lead. Go where there is no road and leave tracks," which is a
very
beautiful
Taoist
sentiment, and I do think it's a little bit Buddhist. Frankly, but I mean, it's an anarchist thing.
Anarchist Buddhist,
whatever. So I just think that's there's a lot of things like that in the book which are very, very charming. Let's see. So here's another question. I'm not sure we're going to be able to answer it.
Thank you both for sharing this beautiful work. Can you speak at all about Pey's other work, and is there anything you'd want to see make its way into English? I don't know.
Is there a world of anything I want to see?
Of Serge Pey's.
Of him. Well, there is a second collection of 30 stories. I haven't read it. It might be nice. It's a follow-up in some ways. But basically, his main output is poems, very, very many, and sort of theatre pieces, or sort of street theatre pieces, or very small one-act plays, things like that. And I think it's rather unfortunate that he's got an enormous body of work, and he has won all kinds of prizes, and he's very much celebrated in the French literary world. So it's rather striking that nothing much of his has made its way into English, and it's a great shame. I think it's a great shame. Yeah, I think there's some work to be done.
So maybe there's more out there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
But I don't think there's anything else probably much like the thing that we've been talking about tonight. I think it's a little bit sui generis, even within his work, because it's so personal, it's so autobiographical in the broadest sense of the word.
So the other stories don't have this personal, historic family connection? We don't know. We haven't read them.
Well, some of them do and some of them don't. But in the end, the whole thing, it does cohere as a kind of testimonial from him about his roots and his background.
Okay.
So yeah, I think they can be seen as a whole.
Okay.
But his other work, I don't think. I mean, I don't know it well enough to say, but I don't think most of his poetry revolves around the same things, but he has developed a kind of a big attachment to. There's a famous Spanish poet, you've probably heard of him, Antonio Machado. Antonio Machado is buried in Collioure, which is very, very close by.
Oh, really?
He was in one of these camps, in fact, maybe the same one,
Okay.
and died soon after he arrived. He had to walk over the Pyrenees too. He's considered one of the greatest poets of the Spanish 20th century.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, he was one of the many people. There were many other celebrities as well who were in part of that exodus.
Yeah.
So and I know that Pey has been very active in making sure that he's memorialized. There's a cemetery where he's buried. They're always having poetry readings there over his grave and all kinds of things happening there. So I know that he's very active in that regard. Even though Machado was not by any means an anarchist, he was,
Right.
He was Spanish.
Beautiful poet. Yeah.
Beautiful poet, and his thing was, he's a somber poet of the fact that Spain is always in conflict with itself. So I mean, it's not that he didn't take sides in the Civil War, but he certainly wasn't. He wasn't an ardent Republican.
He wasn't primarily a political poet. Yeah. There's another question here from Howard Swerdloff. He writes, Isabel Allende's Long Petal of the Sea also revolves around refugees in these same French concentration camps. Do you think the publisher was motivated by the success of Allende's book to bring this translation to the English-speaking world? And why do you think we are recovering this lost history now?
Recovering what?
Recovering this lost history now.
Oh. Well, there's two parts to the question, right?
Right.
The first part, I don't think there's any connection between Isabel Allende and this guy, Serge Pey.
Yeah.
First of all. I mean, if that was part of what the question meant.
It was, yeah.
The broader question of why this is being recovered. I mean, the French don't want to recover it for the reasons that I said before. They'd very much sooner forget all about those concentration camps that they set up and just talk about, the Nazi Holocaust, if you like. Now they're very keen to talk about that, naturally. I mean, they're quite correctly. But, you don't hear much about French concentration camps. It's like asking the British, what about those concentration camps in South Africa that they set up around the turn of the last century? What happened? What about those? I mean, they kind of invented the concentration camp as such.
Yeah.
The Brits invented it, not the Germans. The Germans, of course, they're very good at it. I mean, to put it mildly. I don't really know what Mr. Swerdloff is saying about why I don't know who is retrieving really. Who is retrieving?
maybe he's referring to what we were talking about earlier, that it does seem like the refugee situation in Europe now is recapitulating some of the dynamics that were happening.
Certainly true. Yeah, very, very true. Yeah.
70 years ago. Yeah, yes. 80 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see.
It's a good question. I mean, I don't think we've really fully answered it.
Yeah. Here's another question. Donald mentions that this book is a work of memory. Do you know if Pey interviewed family members before writing these stories? Or do you think?
I have no idea.
Yeah, we just don't know, right? We're not in contact.
I have no idea. I mean, he knew his family members. He didn't have to interview them, probably. I mean, he seems to be inheriting a culture, and he grew up, with a bunch of anarchists around the kitchen table. They were fighting as resistance the French during the war. He was born in 1950.
Yeah.
So I mean, to say these people were hardened radicals that he grew up with in Toulouse, which even to this day has a very powerful Spanish anarchist neighborhood. I mean, probably not as strong as it was in the wake of the what they call la retirada, which is when everybody came to Spain. But nevertheless, Toulouse still has an enormous Spanish-speaking, emigre community, and he obviously grew up in the middle of that. So many of them were Republicans, and and they were continued to be radical.
They felt very much like stories he had grown up with, that he had sort of.
Yes, I think that's right.
He had probably told at family dinner after family dinner.
Absolutely.
And then he decided.
It's a matter of interviewing anybody. I think he just knew it from his own from his own ears, you know, just
Yeah.
growing up. I mean, that's what I think.
Yeah.
I can't prove it, but it certainly is not some kind of sociologist going around asking questions. That's not it
Okay.
at all. He speaks from within, from his own being, you know, without any question. Yeah, I don't think it's anything to do with, you know, questionnaires or anything like that.
All right, there's a question for me. Is there anything that I, as a novelist, find particularly interesting or useful from Pey's style? I have to admit, I only read it a couple weeks ago, so I think we'll just have to wait and see whether I'll be able to use the. I did find some of the imagery quite beautiful, and there's an interesting. It's interesting that he's a performance poet, that he's an action poet, because there's an interesting way that the language is between oral and written. Although I have to say that the translation is so polished and so lapidary that it feels very written. But it does feel that there are voices. You feel the voices. Like that's definitely part of the way the fiction is put together. So.
Well, I like that. I'm happy that it's lapidary, but I think the lapidariness comes from him. I mean, you know, I mean, I think I was perhaps able to convey it, but basically, you know,
We'll say
I mean, I appreciate you saying that, man.
Yeah.
It's a meeting between the two of you, Donald. You got to take a little credit for the lapidariness.
Yeah.
Well, first off, I want to thank both of you so much for tonight. Caleb,
Thank
Donald, it's a beautiful book. I posted the link to purchase it in the chat earlier, so please click on that. You can find out more about what we have going on too on our website at www.communitybookstore.net. We have a lot of more events coming up that I mentioned at the start. Otherwise, please, thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks you again for your time, Caleb and Donald. And we just want to wish everyone a great week, a safe week, a healthy week. So good night.
Good night.
Good night, Hal. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Good night, Donald.
Our pleasure.
Good night, Caleb. Take
Great
care.
to meet you,
Next time.
Donald. Yes.
Yeah, next time.